Picture this. A 17-year-old kid shuffles through the hallways of Riverside High School, head down, oversized gray hoodie swallowing his frame whole. Danny Martinez looks like every bully's dream target. Quiet, small, never makes eye contact. What those bullies don't know is that this seemingly defenseless teenager has spent the last 8 years mastering one of the world's most lethal martial arts. When Connor Blake and his crew decide to make Danny their next victim, they're about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you never see coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Danny Martinez had perfected the art of being invisible. At Riverside High School, a sprawling brick complex nestled in the heart of a Colorado suburb, Danny moved through the crowded hallways like a ghost. His daily uniform never varied: faded jeans, worn sneakers, and that same gray hoodie that had seen better days 3 years ago. The hood was almost always up, casting shadows across his face that made it easy for teachers to forget his name and classmates to overlook his existence entirely. This invisibility wasn't accidental. Danny had cultivated it with the same discipline and precision that he applied to everything else in his life. Every morning, he would slip into Riverside High through the side entrance near the art wing, avoiding the main lobby where Connor Blake and his football teammates held court like kings surveying their domain. He knew which water fountains were least crowded, which bathroom stalls offered the most privacy, and exactly which route through the cafeteria would get him to an empty table without drawing attention. The other students saw what Danny wanted them to see: a shy, unremarkable kid who probably spent his weekends playing video games in his mother's basement. They had no idea that Danny's weekends were actually spent in a different world entirely, one where silence was replaced by the sharp crack of breaking boards and the rhythmic counting of catiforms. They couldn't have imagined that beneath his baggy clothes lay muscles carved by years of relentless training, or that his seemingly nervous hands could generate enough force to shatter concrete blocks. Danny's father, Robert Martinez, owned the Valley Martial Arts Academy on the outskirts of town. It was a modest dojo, nothing fancy, with scuffed wooden floors and mirrors that had collected their share of cracks over the years. But what it lacked in aesthetics, it made up for in authenticity. Roberto had immigrated from Mexico 22 years ago with nothing but a black belt in Shotokan karate and an unshakable belief that martial arts could transform lives. He had built his academy from the ground up, teaching traditional values alongside traditional techniques. The dojo was where Danny truly came alive. Away from the judgmental eyes of his classmates, he moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy his awkward teenage body. His kicks cut through the air with surgical precision, his punches landed with devastating accuracy, and his kata forms flowed like poetry written in motion. At 14, he had earned his black belt, becoming the youngest student in the academy's history to achieve that rank. Now at 17, he was already working toward his second-degree black belt, a level that most martial artists took decades to reach. But with this skill came responsibility, a burden that Danny's father had impressed upon him from his very first lesson. Roberto Martinez believed deeply in the philosophy that martial arts were never to be used for aggression, only for protection when absolutely necessary. He had seen too many young fighters let their abilities corrupt them, turning them into the very bullies they had originally sought to defend against. The power to hurt others, Roberto taught his son, must always be tempered by the wisdom to choose restraint. This philosophy had shaped Danny's entire approach to high school life. When classmates made jokes about his appearance, he remembered his father's words about the strength found in silence. When other students excluded him from their groups, he reminded himself that true confidence came from within, not from the approval of others. And when he witnessed bullying in the hallways, as he did almost daily at Riverside High, he forced himself to walk away, even when every fiber of his being screamed for action. The bullying at Riverside High had reached epidemic proportions over the past 2 years. Budget cuts had eliminated the school's counseling programs and reduced the teaching staff to skeleton crews who barely had time to cover their curriculum, let alone monitor student behavior. Into this vacuum had stepped Connor Blake, a senior quarterback whose combination of athletic prowess and social media savvy had earned him a following that extended far beyond the school's walls. Connor had turned harassment into entertainment, live streaming his encounters with weaker students to an audience that cheered his cruelty and begged for more. Connor's usual targets were the kids society had labeled as different, the art students with their unconventional clothing, the academic achievers who prioritized books over social status, the quiet ones who ate lunch alone. He had developed a sophisticated system of psychological warfare, using his knowledge of social media algorithms to ensure maximum humiliation for his victims. A single video of Connor mocking a student could rack up thousands of views within hours, turning isolated incidents of bullying into viral phenomena that followed kids home and destroyed their sense of safety. Danny had been attending Riverside High for 2.5 years, and in all that time, he had managed to avoid Connor's attention. This wasn't luck, it was strategy. Danny had studied Connor's patterns the way a general might study an enemy's movements. He knew that Connor preferred targets who would react dramatically, providing content that would generate views and comments. He understood that Connor was drawn to students who had something to lose, whether it was social standing, academic reputation, or artistic projects they cared about. By maintaining his invisible persona, Danny had successfully convinced Connor that he wasn't worth the effort. There was no social standing to destroy because Danny had none to begin with. There were no prized possessions to threaten because Danny kept his true passions hidden, and there would be no dramatic reaction because Danny had trained himself to show no emotion, even when his heart was pounding with rage at the injustices he witnessed daily. But invisibility, Danny was about to learn, could only protect him for so long. And sometimes, the very qualities that make someone invisible to bullies also make them the perfect person to stand up for those who can't protect themselves. The autumn morning that would change everything started like any other. Danny arrived at school early, using his key to the art wing that Miss Chen had given him for his volunteer work, helping with the morning setup. He enjoyed these quiet moments before the chaos of the school day began, when the hallways were empty and he could move freely without calculating every step. As he walked toward his locker, he heard voices coming from around the corner near the main hallway. At first, he planned to simply change his route, as he had done countless times before. But something in the tone of the voices made him pause. There was fear there, real terror, mixed with the kind of pleading that made Danny's stomach clench with familiar anger. Against his better judgment, he found himself moving closer to the sound, staying pressed against the wall to avoid being seen. What he witnessed around that corner would test every principle his father had taught him about restraint and wisdom. It would force him to choose between the safety of invisibility and the moral obligation to act. And it would begin a chain of events that would transform not just Danny's life, but the entire culture of Riverside High School. The scene unfolding in the main hallway was one that Danny had witnessed variations of dozens of times before, but this morning felt different. Sophie Williams, a quiet freshman with paint-stained fingers and dreams bigger than her small-town surroundings, was backed against the row of lockers near the main entrance. Her art portfolio was scattered across the floor, months of work trampled under the feet of 3 seniors who towered over her like predators circling wounded prey. Connor Blake stood in the center of the group, his phone held high to capture every moment of Sophie's humiliation. His perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning sunlight streaming through the school's front windows, and his Letterman jacket bore the patches and pins that marked him as Riverside High's golden boy. Everything about Connor projected confidence and power, from his athletic build to the way he commanded the attention of everyone around him. To his left stood Trevor Nash, Connor's constant companion and social media strategist. Trevor was the one who edited Connor's videos, adding music and effects that transformed simple cruelty into viral entertainment. He was smaller than Connor but made up for it with a vicious creativity that had turned online harassment into an art form. Trevor's own phone was out, recording from a different angle to ensure they captured every moment of Sophie's breakdown. The third member of their group was Madison Reed, a senior whose beauty was matched only by her complete absence of empathy. Madison served as Connor's lieutenant in the complex social hierarchy of Riverside High, using her position as student council vice president to provide their activities with a veneer of official sanction. She was the one who usually selected their targets, identifying the students who would generate the most views and the least resistance from school administration. Sophie herself was everything that Connor's audience loved to hate. At 15, she was small for her age, with wild curly hair that she had recently dyed purple in an act of rebellion that her conservative parents still hadn't forgiven. Her clothes came from thrift stores and clearance racks, but she wore them with a confidence that suggested she valued creativity over conformity. Her backpack was covered in patches promoting various social causes, and her fingers were permanently stained with paint from her countless hours in the art room. What made Sophie an particularly appealing target for Connor was her passion for her artwork. Unlike many of Connor's previous victims who could retreat into anonymity after their humiliation, Sophie's art was public. Her paintings hung in the school hallways, her digital designs were featured on the school website, and her comics were published in the student literary magazine. By destroying her portfolio, Connor wasn't just humiliating Sophie in the moment. He was attacking the very foundation of her identity and future aspirations. Danny watched in growing horror as Connor kicked at the scattered drawings, his expensive sneakers leaving dirty footprints across Sophie's carefully crafted illustrations. The portfolio represented hundreds of hours of work, pieces that Sophie had been preparing to submit to art schools and scholarship competitions. Each damaged drawing was a door being slammed shut on her dreams, and Connor knew it. Sophie's reaction was everything Connor could have hoped for from a content creation standpoint. Tears streamed down her face as she tried desperately to gather her artwork, only to have Madison step on her fingers and Trevor kick the drawings further away. Her sobs provided the perfect audio for Connor's live stream, and the comments were already pouring in from viewers who found her pain entertaining. This was the moment that Danny's father had warned him about since his very first karate lesson. This was the test of character that separated true martial artists from mere fighters. Roberto Martinez had always taught his son that power without restraint was meaningless, but restraint without action in the face of genuine injustice was cowardice. The question wasn't whether Danny had the ability to stop what was happening. The question was whether he had the moral courage to act when action was needed. For 17 years, Danny had lived in the shadows, protecting himself through invisibility and isolation. He had convinced himself that staying hidden was the wise choice, that avoiding conflict was the mature response to a world filled with cruelty. But as he watched Sophie's tears fall onto her ruined artwork, he realized that some things were more important than personal safety. The boy who had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible was about to step into the light, and Riverside High School would never be the same. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Danny's hands trembled as he watched Connor grind his heel into one of Sophie's paintings, a delicate watercolor of a mountain sunrise that had taken her weeks to perfect. The casual cruelty of the gesture sent a surge of anger through Danny's chest that he had never experienced before. This wasn't just bullying, it was the systematic destruction of someone's soul, broadcast live for the entertainment of strangers who would never understand the cost of their amusement. Sophie's pleading voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Please, Connor, those are for my college applications. I need them for my scholarship submissions. Please don't do this." Her words were broken by sobs that made Danny's heart clench with a pain he didn't recognize. He had spent so many years building walls around his emotions, teaching himself to feel nothing when he witnessed injustice, that this sudden flood of empathy caught him completely off guard. Connor's response was to laugh, a sound that echoed off the empty hallway walls with a coldness that made Danny's blood run cold. College applications, scholarship submissions. Connor's voice dripped with mock concern as he held his phone closer to Sophie's tear-streaked face. "Did you guys hear that? Little Sophie here thinks she's going to be an artist. She thinks someone's going to pay her to draw pictures like a kindergartner." The comments on Connor's livestream were scrolling by faster than anyone could read them, but Danny caught glimpses of the cruelty that his classmates were typing from behind their phone screens. "Make her eat the paint," one comment read. "Draw on her face," suggested another. The anonymity of the internet had transformed ordinary teenagers into a mob of faceless tormentors, each one trying to outdo the others in their suggestions for Sophie's humiliation. Trevor moved closer to Sophie with his phone, zooming in on her face to capture every tear for his audience. "This is what happens when you think you're special," he said, his voice taking on the tone of a nature documentary narrator. "Watch as the art freak learns her place in the ecosystem of Riverside High." He kicked at another one of Sophie's drawings, sending it sliding across the polished floor toward the main entrance, where early arriving students would soon trample it underfoot. Madison pulled out her own phone, switching to her popular Instagram account that had thousands of followers from schools across the state. Starting the day right at Riverside High, she announced to her audience, teaching some valuable life lessons about reality versus fantasy. She aimed her camera at Sophie's portfolio, focusing on the damage they had already inflicted. Some people need to learn that not everyone can be an artist. Some people need to learn to dream smaller. The systematic nature of their attack was what finally broke through Danny's paralysis. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was a calculated performance designed to maximize both Sophie's suffering and their own social media engagement. They had turned a human being into content, transforming her pain into their profit, and they were doing it with the casual efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Danny thought of his father's words about the responsibility that came with power. Roberto Martinez had always taught his son that martial arts were not just about physical techniques, but about the development of character. A true martial artist, his father had said countless times, is someone who has the strength to fight but chooses peace. But when peace is no longer possible, when the innocent are being harmed, then a true martial artist must have the courage to act. The moment of decision came when Connor reached down and grabbed Sophie's sketchbook, the one that contained her most personal artwork. Danny knew from his observations in the art room that this particular sketchbook was Sophie's sanctuary, filled with drawings that she had never shown to anyone else. They were her private thoughts made visible, her innermost feelings translated into lines and colors that spoke to her soul. Connor held the sketchbook high above his head, his phone capturing every moment as he prepared to tear it in half. "Let's see what other masterpieces our little artist has been hiding," he announced to his audience. Sophie's screams of, "No, please, not that one!" only seemed to encourage him further. That was the moment Danny Martinez stepped out of the shadows and into the light. "Put it down." Danny's voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried an authority that made all four of them freeze in surprise. He had emerged from around the corner with such silent grace that none of them had noticed his approach. Now he stood about 10 feet away from their group, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture deceptively casual. Connor's first reaction was laughter. "Oh, look what we have here," he said, turning his phone toward Danny to capture this unexpected development. The invisible man finally decides to show himself. "What's your name again, hoodie boy? I don't think we've ever been properly introduced." Danny didn't respond to the question. Instead, he took a single step forward, his movement so fluid and controlled that it seemed to glide rather than walk. "I said, put it down," he repeated, his voice still calm but now carrying an undertone that made Trevor instinctively step backward. Madison was the first to recognize that something was different about this intervention. She had seen plenty of students attempt to stand up to Connor before, and they all had the same desperate energy, the same trembling voice that betrayed their fear. But Danny radiated a stillness that she found unsettling. "Connor," she said quietly, "maybe we should just go. First period starts in 20 minutes. But Connor was already too invested in the performance to back down now. His live stream was generating more viewers than any of his previous videos, and the comments were encouraging him to escalate the situation. "2 freaks for the price of 1, he announced to his audience. "This is turning into the best Monday morning entertainment we've had all year." Trevor raised his phone to get a better angle on Danny, but something made him hesitate. There was something in Danny's eyes, a depth of confidence that didn't match his nervous teenager appearance. "Connor," Trevor said, echoing Madison's concern, "I think we got enough content for today. We should probably wrap this up." Connor ignored them both, his attention focused entirely on Danny. "So what's your plan here, hero? You gonna save the day? You gonna rescue the little art freak from the big bad bullies?" He took a step toward Danny, still holding Sophie's sketchbook above his head. "Let me guess, you're gonna tell a teacher, right? Gonna run to Principal Foster and tattle on us?" Danny's response was to take another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Last chance," he said simply. "Put down the sketchbook and walk away." The threat in those words was unmistakable, and for the first time since Danny had appeared, Connor felt a flutter of uncertainty in his chest. But he was too far into the performance to back down now, and his audience was watching. "Or what?" Connor challenged, his voice rising with false bravado. "What are you going to do about it, hoodie boy?" What happened next occurred so quickly that even Danny was surprised by his own speed. Years of training had conditioned his body to respond to threats with lightning-fast reflexes, but he had never tested those reflexes against a real opponent outside the controlled environment of his father's dojo. When Connor made the mistake of lunging forward to shove Danny with his free hand, Danny's muscle memory took over completely. Danny sidestepped Connor's clumsy attack with a movement so smooth it looked choreographed. As Connor's momentum carried him past, Danny reached out with surgical precision and applied pressure to a specific point on Connor's wrist. The technique was called te hodoki in traditional Shotokan karate, a joint manipulation that caused temporary paralysis of the hand muscles without causing permanent damage. Connor's fingers opened involuntarily, and Sophie's sketchbook dropped safely to the floor. Before Connor could even process what had happened, Danny was behind him, applying a gentle but irresistible pressure to Connor's shoulder that forced him to his knees. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, and Connor found himself kneeling on the floor of the hallway, completely unable to understand how he had gotten there. Trevor and Madison watched in stunned silence as their seemingly invincible leader was reduced to a confused teenager kneeling on the ground. Trevor's phone was still recording, but he had forgotten to narrate what was happening. His audience was flooding the comments with confusion and demands for explanation, but Trevor was too shocked to respond. Danny released Connor's shoulder and took a step back, his breathing completely steady despite what had just occurred. "Sophie," he said softly, not taking his eyes off Connor, "collect your artwork. We are leaving." Sophie, who had been frozen in terror during the entire confrontation, suddenly sprang into action. She scrambled to gather her scattered drawings, her hands shaking as she tried to assess the damage to her portfolio. Several pieces were beyond repair, but most of her work was salvageable. She clutched her rescued sketchbook to her chest like a precious artifact, tears of relief streaming down her face. Connor struggled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. The humiliation of being taken down by someone he had dismissed as a weakling was bad enough, but the fact that it had been broadcast live to hundreds of viewers made it unbearable. "You're dead," he snarled at Danny, his voice cracking with emotion. "You have no idea what you just did. You have no idea who you're messing with." Danny's response was to adjust his hood slightly, a gesture so casual it made Connor's threat seem hollow. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," Danny said quietly. "The question is, do you know who you're messing with?" The challenge in those words was unmistakable, and Connor felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine fear. There was something about Danny's stillness, his complete lack of posture or bravado, that suggested reserves of power that Connor couldn't fathom. This wasn't the desperate flailing of a victim fighting back. This was the controlled confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. Madison grabbed Connor's arm, her usual composure cracking. "We need to go," she said urgently. "Now." Before teachers start arriving. She had been recording the entire encounter on her phone, and she could already see her follower count dropping as viewers realized they had been supporting the wrong side. The narrative of their morning entertainment had suddenly shifted, and they were no longer the heroes of their own story. Trevor was already backing toward the main entrance, his phone forgotten in his hand. He had built his entire social media presence on the foundation of Connor's seeming invincibility, and watching that foundation crumble in real time was terrifying. "Connor, seriously, we need to leave," he said, his voice high with panic. "This is getting out of hand." But Connor was too angry to think strategically. The public humiliation had triggered something primal in him, a rage that overrode his usual calculating nature. "This isn't over," he told Danny, his voice carrying a promise of violence that made Sophie flinch. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." Danny's response was to shift his weight slightly, a movement so subtle that only someone trained in martial arts would recognize it as a defensive stance. "If you come at me again," Danny said, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he had used throughout the encounter, "I won't be gentle." The word gentle sent a chill through Connor's body as he realized that what he had just experienced was Danny holding back. The technique that had put him on his knees so easily was apparently just a fraction of what this quiet teenager was capable of. For the first time in his high school career, Connor Blake was faced with an opponent who didn't fear him, and the realization was more terrifying than any threat. Principal Foster's voice echoed from the main hallway as she began her morning rounds, her heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that meant business. "Students should be in their homerooms by now," she called out, her tone suggesting that anyone caught loitering would face consequences. Madison didn't wait for Connor's decision. She grabbed Trevor's arm and headed for the nearest exit, her Instagram livestream forgotten in her haste to escape. Trevor followed her lead, his phone shaking in his hand as he realized that his morning of entertainment had turned into a potential disaster for their entire group. Connor stood alone in the hallway, his chest heaving with rage and embarrassment. The sound of Principal Foster's approaching footsteps forced him to make a choice between continuing the confrontation and preserving his carefully constructed reputation. With a final glare at Danny that promised future retribution, he turned and walked quickly toward the opposite exit, his shoulders tense with barely contained fury. Danny watched him go, his posture remaining relaxed until Connor disappeared around the corner. Only then did he allow himself to acknowledge the adrenaline that was coursing through his system. His hands were perfectly steady, his breathing controlled, but his heart was pounding with the rush of having finally used his skills in defense of someone who needed protection. Sophie stood beside him, her arms full of rescued artwork, tears still streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Danny understood. "Are you okay?" Danny asked, his voice gentle in a way that surprised them both. After years of avoiding meaningful interaction with his classmates, he found himself genuinely concerned about this girl's well-being. Sophie nodded, though her trembling hand suggested otherwise. "I think so. Some of the pieces are ruined, but most of them are okay." She looked up at Danny with eyes that were wide with curiosity and gratitude. "I'm Sophie Williams. I know we go to the same school, but I don't think we've ever actually talked before." "Danny Martinez," he replied, reaching down to help her collect the last few scattered drawings. As he handed her a charcoal sketch of a bird in flight, he noticed the incredible detail in her work. "These are really good," he said, and meant it. Sophie's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire appearance. "You really think so? I mean, I know they're not perfect, but I've been working on getting into art school and—" She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious about sharing her dreams with someone she barely knew. "They're more than good," Danny said firmly. "They're beautiful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The conviction in his voice surprised them both, and Sophie felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sunshine streaming through the windows. As they walked toward the main hallway together, Sophie carrying her rescued portfolio and Danny keeping pace beside her, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows near the art wing. Marcus Thompson, a junior who had been one of Connor's crew members until recently, had witnessed the entire encounter from his hiding spot behind a bank of lockers. Marcus had been struggling with his own conscience for months, watching Connor's behavior escalate from harmless pranks to genuine cruelty. He had participated in some of the earlier incidents, but the systematic destruction of Sophie's artwork had finally crossed a line that he couldn't ignore. He had been trying to work up the courage to intervene when Danny appeared and handled the situation with a skill that left Marcus speechless. Now, as he watched Danny and Sophie disappear around the corner, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. For the first time since Connor had recruited him into his inner circle, Marcus saw an alternative to the toxic culture that had consumed Riverside High. He saw the possibility of change, embodied in a quiet teenager who had stepped out of the shadows to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. The morning bell rang, signaling the start of another day at Riverside High School. But something fundamental had shifted in the building's atmosphere. Word of the confrontation would spread quickly through the student body, carried by the witnesses who had seen Connor Blake brought to his knees by someone they had never noticed before. The videos that Trevor and Madison had recorded would be analyzed and shared, creating a narrative that would challenge everything the students thought they knew about power and strength. For Danny Martinez, the boy who had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, there was no going back to the shadows. His actions in the hallway had marked him as a target for Connor's revenge, but they had also marked him as a protector for those who needed one. The training his father had given him, the philosophy of using strength to defend the weak, had finally found its purpose. As Danny settled into his seat in Ms. Chen's homeroom, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. The story of his confrontation with Connor was already spreading through the school's social networks, transformed and embellished with each telling. Some students looked at him with admiration, others with fear, and still others with the calculating interest of those who saw an opportunity to exploit his newfound reputation. But Danny's attention was focused on Sophie, who had taken a seat near the front of the classroom. She was carefully arranging her rescued artwork in a new portfolio, her movements deliberate and reverent as she handled each piece. The smile on her face was radiant, the joy of someone who had been given back something precious that they thought they had lost forever. Ms. Chen called the class to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen it all in her 15 years of teaching. "Before we begin today's lesson," she announced, "I want to remind everyone that our school has a zero-tolerance policy for bullying and harassment. If anyone has witnessed or experienced any incidents, please don't hesitate to come forward." Danny caught Sophie's eye across the classroom, and she gave him a small smile that carried more gratitude than words could express. In that moment, Danny understood that his years of training had been preparing him for exactly this. Not for tournaments or competitions, but for the moments when someone needed a protector and he was the only one willing to step forward. The transformation of Danny Martinez had begun, and with it, the transformation of Riverside High School. The quiet teenager who had spent years hiding his strength was about to discover that sometimes the greatest power comes not from remaining invisible, but from choosing to be seen when it matters most. The transformation of Danny Martinez from invisible observer to reluctant protector didn't happen overnight, but the signs were impossible to ignore. Within hours of his confrontation with Connor Blake, the entire ecosystem of Riverside High School had shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. Students who had never spoken to Danny before suddenly found reasons to walk past his locker, their curious glances mixing admiration with barely concealed fear. The hallways buzzed with whispered conversations about the quiet kid who had made Connor Blake kneel in submission with nothing more than a touch. Sophie Williams had become Danny's shadow, though she tried to make it seem casual. She would appear at his locker between classes, offering to share her notes or asking questions about homework assignments they both knew she understood perfectly. Her presence was both comforting and unsettling to Danny, who had grown accustomed to navigating the school day in complete solitude. Now he found himself responsible for someone else's well-being, a weight that felt heavier than any physical training he had ever endured. The first real test of this new dynamic came 3 days after the incident with Connor. Danny was making his way to the library during lunch when he heard familiar sounds of distress coming from the stairwell near the gymnasium. His first instinct was to continue walking, to return to the safety of anonymity that had protected him for so long. But Sophie's grateful smile flashed through his mind, and he found himself moving toward the sound instead of away from it. What he discovered in the stairwell made his blood run cold. 2 sophomore boys had cornered a freshman named Michael Chen, no relation to Ms. Chen despite sharing the same surname. Michael was small even for his age, with thick glasses and a nervous stutter that made him an easy target for anyone looking to feel powerful at someone else's expense. The 2 sophomores, emboldened by stories of Connor's humiliation and eager to prove their own toughness, had decided to establish their dominance over someone they perceived as even weaker than themselves. "Come on, stutter boy," one of them taunted, shoving Michael against the concrete wall. "Tell us again about your little science project. We want to hear you try to explain quantum physics with that mouth of yours." His companion laughed and pulled out his phone, clearly intending to record Michael's humiliation for their own social media audience. Michael's backpack lay open on the floor, its contents scattered across the stairs. His carefully organized binders and notebooks were being kicked around like trash, and his prized calculator, a gift from his engineer father, had been thrown against the wall with enough force to crack its display. The sight of the damaged calculator seemed to break something inside Michael, and he began to cry with the helpless desperation of someone who had endured too much. Danny stood at the top of the stairwell, watching the scene unfold with growing anger. These weren't Connor's crew members seeking revenge. These were opportunists who had seen weakness and decided to exploit it. They represented everything that was wrong with Riverside High School's culture, the endless cycle of victimization that turned the hurt into the hurtful. "Stop," Danny's voice echoed in the stairwell, with such authority that both sophomores immediately looked up. They had been so focused on their victim that they hadn't noticed Danny's approach, and his sudden appearance startled them into silence. The taller of the two sophomores, a boy named Kevin Walsh, whose father coached Little League baseball, tried to project confidence, despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "This doesn't concern you, Martinez," he said, using Danny's last name with the kind of forced familiarity that bullies employed when they felt threatened. "Just keep walking and mind your own business." Danny descended the stairs slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Michael, collect your things," he said calmly, not taking his eyes off Kevin and his friend. "We're leaving." Kevin's companion, a stocky boy named Brad Morrison, who happened to be Connor Blake's younger cousin, stepped forward with the swagger of someone who believed his family connections made him untouchable. "You think you're some kind of tough guy now?" Brad sneered, his phone still recording. "You got lucky with Connor, but that doesn't mean you can just waltz around here playing superhero." The mention of Connor's name sent a chill through the stairwell. Danny had been wondering when Connor would make his move, when the promised revenge would finally materialize. The fact that Connor was using his family connections to wage proxy wars through younger students showed a level of strategic thinking that Danny found more troubling than direct confrontation would have been. "I'm not playing anything," Danny replied, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had stopped Connor in his tracks. "And I'm not going to ask again." "Leave him alone." Brad's response was to lunge forward, his phone forgotten as he tried to grab Danny's hoodie. It was a clumsy attack, driven more by bravado than skill, and Danny handled it with the same effortless precision he had shown with Connor. A simple redirection of Brad's momentum sent him stumbling past Danny and into the wall, where he slumped to the floor with a dazed expression. Kevin watched his friend's defeat with growing panic. Unlike Connor, who had been humiliated in front of a live stream audience, Kevin had the option of walking away with his dignity intact. "This isn't over," he said, trying to inject menace into his voice as he helped Brad to his feet. "Connor knows what you did. He's not going to forget." "Neither will I," Danny replied, and something in his tone made Kevin's threat die in his throat. The two sophomores retreated up the stairs, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Michael Chen stood against the wall, his belongings clutched to his chest, staring at Danny with a mixture of awe and terror. "Thank you," he whispered, his stutter making the words almost unintelligible. "I don't know what they would have done if you hadn't come." Danny helped Michael gather the last of his scattered belongings, noticing the careful way the younger boy handled his damaged calculator. "Are you okay?" Danny asked, surprised by the genuine concern in his own voice. Michael nodded, though his trembling hand suggested otherwise. "I'm fine. I'm used to it." The resignation in his voice was heartbreaking, the acceptance of someone who had been taught that victimization was simply part of his daily reality. "You shouldn't have to be used to it," Danny said firmly. "No one should have to be used to this." As they walked together toward the main hallway, Michael worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since Danny's intervention. "How did you do that? How did you make them stop without really hurting them?" Danny hesitated, unsure how to explain years of martial arts training to someone who had never thrown a punch in his life. "My father runs a karate school," he said finally. "He's been teaching me since I was 8. Michael's eyes widened with fascination. "Could you teach me? I mean, I know I'm not exactly fighter material, but maybe if I knew how to defend myself." He trailed off, clearly embarrassed by his own vulnerability. The request caught Danny off guard. He had never considered himself teacher material, despite years of helping his father with younger students at the dojo. But there was something in Michael's desperate hope that reminded Danny of his own younger self, the scared kid who had first walked into his father's academy looking for a way to protect himself from a world that seemed determined to hurt him. "I don't know," Danny said honestly. "It's not really about fighting. It's about discipline, respect, self-control. It takes years to learn properly." "I don't care how long it takes," Michael said with surprising intensity. "I'm tired of being afraid all the time. I'm tired of dreading every day at school. If there's a chance I could learn to stand up for myself, I'll do whatever it takes." Danny saw something in Michael's eyes that he recognized from his own reflection years ago. The desperate determination of someone who had been pushed too far and was ready to push back. "Come to Valley Martial Arts Academy after school today," Danny said impulsively. "Ask for Roberto Martinez. Tell him Danny sent you." Michael's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "Really? You'd do that for me?" "Everyone deserves to feel safe," Danny replied, echoing words his father had spoken to him countless times over the years. Everyone deserves to have confidence in themselves. As they parted ways in the main hallway, Danny felt a strange sense of satisfaction that he had never experienced before. For years he had been the recipient of his father's wisdom and training, but he had never had the opportunity to pass those gifts on to someone else. The idea of helping Michael transform from victim to confident young man was both terrifying and exhilarating. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and curious stares. Danny's reputation was spreading beyond the immediate witnesses to his confrontations, taking on a life of its own as stories were embellished and details were added with each telling. By the final bell, he had become something of a legend, the quiet kid who could take down bullies with mysterious martial arts techniques. But with fame came responsibility, and Danny was beginning to understand that his days of invisibility were truly over. As he walked toward his locker, he was intercepted by Sophie Williams, who had been waiting for him with barely contained excitement. "Danny, thank God I found you," Sophie said, slightly out of breath from running across the school to catch him. "I heard about what happened with Michael Chen. Is it true? Did you really take down 2 more bullies?" Danny sighed, realizing that the story had already been exaggerated beyond recognition. "It wasn't that dramatic," he said. "They were picking on a kid. I asked them to stop. They decided to stop. End of story." Sophie's expression suggested she didn't believe his modest version of events, but she didn't push the issue. "Listen, I wanted to ask you something. My friend Marcus Thompson wants to meet you. He says he has something important to discuss." The name was familiar, and Danny realized that Marcus had been one of Connor's crew members until recently. "What does he want?" Danny asked suspiciously. "He wouldn't tell me exactly, but he seemed really serious about it. He said it was about Connor and some kind of plan for revenge." Sophie's voice carried a note of concern that made Danny's stomach tighten with apprehension. Danny had been expecting retaliation from Connor, but he'd assumed it would be direct and immediate. The fact that Connor was apparently planning something more elaborate suggested a level of strategic thinking that made him far more dangerous than Danny had initially realized. "Where does he want to meet?" Danny asked, resigned to the fact that he would have to face whatever Connor had planned sooner or later. "The old gymnasium after school. He said it would be private there, away from any of Connor's friends who might be listening." Sophie hesitated, clearly torn between her desire to help and her fear of making things worse. "Danny, maybe you should just tell Principal Foster about all this. Let the adults handle it." Danny considered the suggestion, but he knew that involving the administration would only escalate the situation in ways that no one could predict. Connor's father was a prominent businessman who donated heavily to the school's athletic programs, and Connor himself was being recruited by several major universities. The school would be reluctant to take any action that might jeopardize those relationships. "I'll talk to Marcus," Danny decided, "but I want you to stay out of this. Whatever Connor is planning, I don't want you getting caught in the middle of it." Sophie's expression hardened with determination. "I'm already in the middle of it," she said firmly. "They destroyed my artwork, Danny. They tried to destroy my future. I'm not going to hide in the corner and let them do it to someone else." The steel in her voice surprised Danny, who had seen only vulnerability in Sophie until that moment, but he was beginning to understand that trauma could forge strength as well as fear, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could become the most determined fighters. "Fine," Danny said, realizing that arguing with Sophie would be pointless. "But we do this my way, no unnecessary risks, no heroics. We find out what Marcus knows, and then we make smart decisions about how to handle it." Sophie nodded. though her eyes sparkled with an excitement that made Danny wonder if he was making a mistake by involving her in what was clearly becoming a dangerous situation. Part 4. The Gathering Storm. The old gymnasium at Riverside High School had been abandoned for nearly a decade, replaced by a newer facility that met modern safety standards and could accommodate the school's growing athletic programs. Now it served as a storage area for outdated equipment and forgotten trophies, its hardwood floors covered with dust and its windows clouded with grime. The space felt haunted by the echoes of past victories and defeats, a monument to the transient nature of high school glory. Danny and Sophie arrived at the gymnasium 15 minutes after the final bell, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway as they made their way to the designated meeting spot. The building felt different after hours, stripped of the energy and chaos that defined it during the school day. Without the constant flow of students and teachers, Riverside High revealed itself as what it truly was: an aging institution struggling to contain the dreams and disappointments of a generation that had already moved on. Marcus Thompson was waiting for them in the center of the old gym, seated on a stack of wrestling mats that had been deemed too worn for competition use. At 17, Marcus was tall and lean, with the kind of natural athleticism that had made him a valuable addition to Connor's crew. His dark hair was cut in the latest style, and his clothes bore the subtle markers of wealth that distinguished the popular kids from the rest of the student body. But there was something different about him now, a nervous energy that suggested his confidence was more fragile than it appeared. "Thanks for coming," Marcus said, standing as they approached. His voice carried none of the swagger that Danny had observed when Marcus was part of Connor's group. Instead, he seemed almost vulnerable, like someone who had been stripped of his protective armor and was learning to navigate the world without it. "Sophie said you had information about Connor," Danny said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. He had no interest in small talk or social niceties, not when the threat of retaliation hung over his head like a sword. Marcus nodded, his expression growing serious. "Connor's planning something big, something that goes way beyond the usual bullying stuff. He's been talking to some people outside the school, people with connections to gangs and drug dealers. He wants to make an example of you, to show everyone that nobody crosses Connor Blake without consequences." The words sent a chill through Danny's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of connections?" "There's this guy named Jake Morrison, Connor's older brother. He dropped out of college last year and got involved with some really bad people in Denver. Connor's been calling him every night, asking for help with his Danny problem. From what I've overheard, Jake's friends are willing to come down here and handle things for the right price." Sophie gasped, her face going pale. "You mean like actual criminals? People who would hurt Danny?" Marcus's grim expression was answer enough. "Connor's not thinking rationally anymore. The humiliation you put him through has broken something in his brain. He's not just angry, he's obsessed. He talks about you constantly, about how you made him look weak in front of everyone. He's convinced that if he doesn't get revenge, he'll lose his reputation permanently." Danny processed this information with the same calm detachment he applied to everything else. The threat was real, but it wasn't unexpected. He had known that standing up to Connor would have consequences, and he had accepted that risk when he chose to protect Sophie. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Why betray your friend?" Marcus's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Friend? Connor Blake has never been my friend. He's been my ticket to popularity, my protection from the same kind of bullying I've watched him inflict on others. But I'm done being part of his crew. I'm done enabling his cruelty." "What changed?" Sophie asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dusty floor as if searching for the right words. "I have a younger sister," he said finally. "Emma. She's in 8th grade at the middle school, and she's starting high school next year. She's smart, creative, different from the other kids. She reminds me a lot of you, actually," he said, nodding toward Sophie. "A few weeks ago, she asked me about Riverside High, about what it would be like when she got here, and I realized that I couldn't look her in the eye and tell her it would be okay, not when I knew what Connor was capable of." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of guilt and self-recognition. Danny could see the internal struggle playing out on Marcus's face, the battle between self-preservation and moral obligation that Danny himself had fought just days before. "So what are you proposing?" Danny asked. "What do you want me to do with this information?" "I want to help you stop him," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I want to make sure that when my sister gets to high school, she doesn't have to be afraid of people like Connor Blake. I want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Danny studied Marcus's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. But all he saw was a young man who had been carrying the weight of his own moral compromises for too long and was finally ready to do something about it. "If you help me, there's no going back," Danny warned. "Connor will consider you a traitor, and that means you'll be a target too." Marcus nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'm already a target. The moment I decided to walk away from his crew, I became his enemy. At least this way, I'll be fighting for something worthwhile." Sophie had been listening to their conversation with growing excitement, her artistic mind already spinning with possibilities. "So what's the plan?" she asked. "How do we stop Connor before he can bring his brother's friends into this?" Danny held up a hand, his mind racing through various scenarios and their potential consequences. "First, we need more information. We need to know exactly what Connor is planning, when he's planning to do it, and who else is involved. Second, we need to be smart about this. We can't just react to whatever Connor throws at us. We need to be proactive." "I can help with the intelligence gathering," Marcus offered. "I still have friends in Connor's extended circle, people who might overhear things or see messages. If I'm careful, I can find out what Connor's planning without him knowing I'm the source. And I can help with documentation," Sophie added. "If we can get evidence of Connor's plans, especially evidence of him trying to bring outside criminals into the school, we can take it to the authorities. That would shut down his operation before it even gets started." Danny nodded approvingly. Both suggestions were smart and relatively low risk, which was exactly what they needed. "There's something else we need to consider," he said. "Connor's not the only bully in this school. If we're going to make a real difference, we need to address the entire culture of intimidation and harassment. We need to create a support network for the kids who are being targeted." The idea was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so, but Danny found himself energized by the challenge. For years, he had been a passive observer of the cruelty that defined high school social dynamics. Now he had the opportunity to actually change things, to create a safer environment for students like Michael Chen and Sophie Williams. "How do we do that?" Sophie asked, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We start small," Danny said. "We identify the kids who are being bullied, and we let them know they're not alone. We teach them basic self-defense, not so they can fight back, but so they can have confidence in themselves. We create a network of support that makes it harder for bullies to operate." Marcus was nodding along, his expression growing more animated as he began to understand the scope of what they were proposing. "It's like creating an anti-bullying underground," he said. "A secret organization dedicated to protecting the vulnerable kids." "Not secret," Danny corrected. "Visible. We want everyone to know that there's an alternative to the current system. We want potential victims to know they have options, and we want bullies to know that they'll face consequences for their actions." The conversation continued for another hour, with the three of them refining their plans and discussing potential obstacles. By the time they left the old gymnasium, they had the foundation of something that could genuinely transform the culture of Riverside High School. It was ambitious, risky, and probably impossible, but it was also necessary. As they walked toward the main entrance together, Danny felt a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he was using his skills and training for something larger than himself. The quiet kid who had spent years hiding in the shadows was finally ready to step into the light, and he wasn't going to do it alone. Part 5, The First Disciples. The Valley Martial Arts Academy occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Riverside's modest downtown district, its exterior marked only by a small sign that read, "Traditional Shotokan Karate," in both English and Spanish. Roberto Martinez had chosen the location specifically because it was removed from the main commercial areas, creating a sanctuary where serious students could train without distraction or pretense. The building itself was unremarkable, but inside, it contained everything necessary for the serious study of martial arts. Hardwood floors, mirrored walls, traditional weapons displays, and an atmosphere of discipline and respect that had been cultivated over 2 decades. Danny arrived at the academy that afternoon with a mix of anticipation and nervousness that he hadn't felt since his own first day as a student. He had called his father during lunch to explain about Michael Chen and to ask permission to bring a potential new student to the dojo. Roberto had been intrigued by Danny's description of the bullying situation at school and had agreed to meet with Michael, though he had warned Danny that teaching was a responsibility that extended far beyond physical techniques. Michael Chen was waiting outside the academy when Danny arrived, his school backpack replaced by a duffel bag that looked too large for his small frame. The younger boy's face was a mixture of excitement and terror, the expression of someone who was about to step into completely unknown territory. His damaged calculator had been replaced by a newer model, but Danny could see that the incident in the stairwell had left deeper wounds than broken electronics. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," Danny said as they approached the academy's entrance. "I almost didn't," Michael admitted, his stutter more pronounced when he was nervous. "I've never done anything like this before. I'm not exactly the athletic type." "Neither was I when I started," Danny said, though he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "My father always says that martial arts isn't about natural ability. It's about willingness to learn and dedication to practice." The interior of the academy was exactly as Danny remembered from his childhood. Clean, sparse, and somehow timeless. The walls were decorated with photographs of Roberto's own teachers and their teachers before them, creating a visual lineage that stretched back generations. Traditional weapons were displayed in glass cases, not as trophies but as reminders of the martial arts' practical origins. The space felt sacred in a way that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the countless hours of sweat and discipline that had been invested within its walls. Roberto Martinez emerged from his office as they entered, and Danny felt the familiar surge of respect and affection that his father's presence always inspired. At 52, Roberto was still in remarkable physical condition, his movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting his craft. His face was weathered but kind, with eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the heart of whoever he was speaking with. "You must be Michael," Roberto said, extending his hand to the nervous freshman. "Danny has told me about your situation at school. I'm sorry to hear that you've been having difficulties." Michael shook Roberto's hand with the careful formality of someone who had been raised to respect adults. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Mr. Martinez. I know you must be busy." "I always have time for someone who is serious about learning," Roberto replied. "But before we begin, I need to understand why you're here. Are you looking for revenge against the people who hurt you? Are you hoping to learn how to fight back against bullies?" The directness of the question caught Michael off guard, and he stammered for a moment before finding his voice. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to stop being afraid all the time. I want to be able to stand up for myself without feeling like I'm going to be destroyed." Roberto nodded approvingly. "That's a good answer. Revenge is a poison that destroys the person seeking it more than the person it's directed toward. But confidence, self-respect, and the ability to defend yourself when necessary, these are valuable gifts that can transform your entire life." Danny watched the interaction with fascination, remembering his own first conversation with his father about martial arts. Roberto had asked him similar questions, probing his motivations and ensuring that he understood the responsibility that came with learning how to hurt others. The conversation had been a rite of passage, a gateway into a world that demanded more than just physical commitment. "Show me your stance," Roberto said to Michael, his tone shifting into teaching mode. "Stand as you would if you were preparing to defend yourself." Michael's attempt at a fighting stance was awkward and unsure, his feet too close together and his hands positioned more for protection than offense. Roberto studied him for a moment, then gently adjusted his posture, explaining the principles behind each correction. "Balance is the foundation of everything in martial arts," Roberto explained, as he guided Michael's feet into a more stable position. "If you cannot maintain your balance, you cannot generate power, and you cannot defend yourself effectively. But balance is not just physical, it's mental and spiritual as well." As the lesson continued, Danny found himself seeing his father's teaching methods with new eyes. Roberto wasn't just instructing Michael in physical techniques, he was beginning the process of rebuilding the boy's confidence from the ground up. Each correction was delivered with patience and encouragement, creating an environment where Michael could learn without fear of judgment or failure. Sophie Williams arrived at the academy halfway through Michael's first lesson, having convinced her aunt to drive her across town after school. She slipped into the building quietly, not wanting to interrupt the instruction, but her presence was immediately noticed by Roberto, who had developed an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings during his decades of training. "You must be Sophie," Roberto said, pausing in his instruction to acknowledge her. "Danny has told me about your situation as well. Are you here to observe, or are you interested in learning?" Sophie's eyes widened with surprise. She had come to the academy primarily to support Michael and to see Danny in his element, but the idea of learning martial arts herself hadn't occurred to her. I'm not sure. I've never thought about it before. Many people believe that martial arts are only for a certain type of person, Roberto said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades dispelling misconceptions. They think you need to be naturally aggressive or physically gifted. But some of my best students have been artists, intellectuals, people who were drawn to the discipline and philosophy rather than the fighting. The idea seemed to intrigue Sophie, who had always been more comfortable expressing herself through creativity than through physical activity. "What would it involve?" she asked. "The same thing it involves for everyone," Roberto replied. "Discipline, respect, patience, and the willingness to fail repeatedly until you succeed. The techniques are the same, whether you're male or female, athletic or artistic. The only difference is in how you apply them to your own unique circumstances." Danny watched Sophie consider the proposition, seeing the wheels turning in her mind as she processed the possibilities. He had never imagined that his intervention in the hallway would lead to this moment, with two of his classmates being introduced to the world that had shaped his entire life. Marcus Thompson arrived at the academy, just as Roberto was demonstrating a basic blocking technique to Michael and Sophie. Danny had texted him the address after their meeting in the old gymnasium, extending an invitation that Marcus had accepted with surprising enthusiasm. Now he stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with the same careful observation that had made him valuable to Connor's crew. "You must be Marcus," Roberto said, somehow managing to continue his demonstration while acknowledging the newcomer. "Danny mentioned that you might be joining us this evening." Marcus nodded, his usual confidence replaced by the uncertainty of someone entering unfamiliar territory. "I've never done anything like this before," he said. "I'm not sure what I'm getting myself into." "None of us are," Roberto replied with a smile. "That's what makes it interesting." As the informal lesson continued, Danny found himself observing his classmates' interactions with his father's teaching methods. Michael was a natural student, absorbing instruction with the same intensity he brought to his academic studies. Sophie approached the techniques with an artist's eye, paying attention to the aesthetic elements of movement and form. Marcus was more cautious, analyzing each instruction before committing to it, but showing flashes of natural ability that suggested he had more athletic potential than he realized. "Martial arts," Roberto explained as he guided them through a series of basic kata movements, "is ultimately about self-improvement. Yes, you will learn techniques that can be used for self-defense, but the real value is in the discipline, focus, and confidence that comes from mastering yourself." The lesson continued for another hour, with Roberto introducing his new students to the fundamental concepts of Shotokan karate. By the end of the session, all three of them were sweating and exhausted, but there was something different in their posture, a subtle shift in the way they carried themselves that spoke to the transformative power of martial arts training. As they prepared to leave, Roberto pulled Danny aside for a private conversation. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "You've taken the lessons I taught you and used them to help others. That's what a true martial artist does." "I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing," Danny admitted. "Connor Blake is planning something serious, and I'm worried that I'm putting my friends in danger by involving them in this." Roberto considered this for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "There's an old saying in martial arts, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. You've chosen to do something, and that choice has inspired others to do the same. That's not putting them in danger. That's giving them the tools to protect themselves." Danny nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. The weight of responsibility was heavier than he had expected, and he was beginning to understand that leadership required making difficult decisions without complete information. As the four teenagers left the academy together, they made plans to return the following day for another lesson. Word would spread quickly through the school about their afternoon activities, adding another layer to the growing legend of Danny Martinez and his mysterious martial arts abilities. But more importantly, they had taken the first step toward creating the support network that could genuinely change the culture of Riverside High School. The transformation was no longer just about Danny Martinez stepping out of the shadows. It was about creating a movement, a community of students who were willing to stand up for each other and refuse to accept bullying as an inevitable part of the high school experience. The quiet kid who had spent years hiding his strength was finally ready to share it with others, and the ripple effects of that decision would change everything. The next 2 weeks at Riverside High School felt like the calm before a hurricane. Connor Blake's absence from his usual haunts around the school created an eerie quiet that made everyone nervous. Teachers noticed the change in atmosphere, but couldn't pinpoint its source. Students whispered about Connor's strange behavior, how he had become withdrawn and secretive, spending his lunch periods making hushed phone calls instead of holding court in the cafeteria. The football team noticed his distraction during practice, his usual aggressive leadership replaced by a cold intensity that made even his teammates uncomfortable. Marcus Thompson had become Danny's primary source of intelligence about Connor's activities, carefully maintaining his position on the periphery of Connor's social circle, while secretly documenting everything he observed. The information he gathered painted a disturbing picture of escalation and desperation. Connor had been in contact with his older brother Jake nearly every day, their conversations growing more heated as Jake's criminal associates demanded payment for their services. Connor had begun stealing money from his parents, selling his expensive electronics, and even attempting to extort money from younger students to finance his revenge scheme. The plan, as Marcus had pieced it together through overheard conversations and intercepted text messages, was both simple and terrifying. Jake Morrison would arrive in Riverside with 2 of his associates on Friday evening, during the homecoming football game, when the entire town would be distracted by the festivities. They would corner Danny in the school parking lot after the game, deliver a beating severe enough to hospitalize him, and disappear back to Denver before local law enforcement could respond effectively. Connor had specifically requested that they avoid permanent damage, but Jake's friends had made it clear that they couldn't guarantee the extent of the injuries once the violence began. Danny received this information during their Thursday evening training session at the Valley Martial Arts Academy, where their small group had grown into something resembling a real martial arts class. Word had spread quietly through the school's underground networks about the safe space that Roberto Martinez provided, and several other students had begun attending the sessions. There was Jennifer Walsh, a junior whose eating disorder had made her a target for cruel comments about her appearance. There was David Kim, a sophomore whose academic achievements had earned him the resentment of students who saw intelligence as a threat to their own self-worth. There was even Sarah Peters, a senior who had been systematically excluded from social events because she couldn't afford the designer clothes that marked membership in the popular crowd. Each of these students brought their own stories of humiliation and fear, creating a tapestry of suffering that revealed just how pervasive the bullying culture at Riverside High had become. Roberto worked with each of them individually, teaching techniques that were tailored to their specific situations and physical capabilities. But more importantly, he was rebuilding their sense of self-worth, helping them understand that they deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. Sophie Williams had emerged as the group's unofficial documentarian, using her artistic skills to create a comprehensive record of the bullying incidents that occurred throughout the school. Her portfolio now contained not just her own artwork, but detailed sketches of harassment scenes, transcripts of threatening messages, and photographs of vandalized lockers and destroyed personal property. She had convinced several victims to share their stories, creating a body of evidence that revealed the systematic nature of the abuse. Michael Chen had transformed the most dramatically of all Roberto's new students. The nervous, stammering freshman who had been cornered in the stairwell just 2 weeks earlier was now moving with increasing confidence, his posture straighter and his voice stronger. He still struggled with the physical aspects of martial arts training, but his determination was absolute. More importantly, he had begun reaching out to other students who were being targeted, offering them the same support and encouragement that Danny had shown him. But despite their growing numbers and increasing confidence, the group faced a fundamental problem. They were still operating within a system that protected the aggressors and blamed the victims. Principal Foster remained largely oblivious to the extent of the bullying problem, viewing isolated incidents as disciplinary issues rather than symptoms of a deeper cultural problem. The teaching staff was overwhelmed and understaffed, unable to monitor the complex social dynamics that played out in hallways, bathrooms, and online spaces. And the school board was primarily concerned with maintaining the institution's reputation and avoiding lawsuits, making them reluctant to acknowledge problems that might reflect poorly on their oversight. Danny understood that confronting Connor's planned attack would require more than just martial arts skills. It would require strategic thinking, careful planning, and the kind of coordinated action that could only come from a united group. As he shared Marcus's intelligence with the assembled students on Thursday evening, he could see the fear in their eyes, but he could also see something else: determination. "We have two choices," Danny said, addressing the group from the center of the dojo's main training area. "We can report what we know to the authorities and hope they take action in time, or we can handle this ourselves. Both options involve risks, and both options could go wrong." Roberto had been listening from the back of the room, his arms crossed and his expression thoughtful. "What does your heart tell you is the right thing to do?" he asked his son. Danny closed his eyes for a moment, searching for clarity in the swirling emotions that had consumed him since his first confrontation with Connor. If we involve the police now, Connor will know that Marcus betrayed him. Marcus becomes a target, and Connor will just postpone his plan until later. The threat doesn't go away, it just gets delayed and possibly made worse. "And if we handle it ourselves?" Sophie asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Then we end this permanently," Danny replied. "We show Connor and anyone else who might be thinking about following his example that this kind of behavior has consequences. We prove that the victims don't have to stay victims." Marcus stood up from his position near the wall, his face pale but resolute. "I'm tired of being afraid," he said. "I'm tired of enabling people like Connor, because it's easier than standing up to them. Whatever you decide to do, I'm with you." One by one, the other students voiced their agreement. Jennifer Walsh, who had been silent for most of the discussion, finally spoke up with a voice that was barely above a whisper. "My little brother starts high school next year," she said. "I don't want him to go through what I've been going through. I don't want any kid to have to feel the way Connor Blake has made me feel." Roberto stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "If you're going to do this," he said solemnly, "you're going to do it the right way. You're going to use only the force necessary to protect yourselves and others. You're going to give Connor and his associates every opportunity to walk away peacefully. And you're going to remember that the goal is not to hurt them, but to stop them from hurting others." Danny nodded, understanding the wisdom in his father's words. "We're not vigilantes," he said to the group. "We're not seeking revenge. We're creating a situation where Connor's plan can't succeed, where he has to face the consequences of his choices, and where everyone can see that bullying doesn't pay." The plan they developed over the next hour was elegant in its simplicity. They would attend the homecoming game as normal, blending in with the crowd of students and families who came to support the football team. Marcus would monitor Connor's communications and alert the group when Jake Morrison and his associates arrived in town. When Connor's crew moved toward the parking lot to execute their ambush, Danny's group would be waiting. The key was to ensure that the confrontation occurred in a public space where witnesses could document everything that happened. Sophie would position herself with her camera equipment in a location that provided clear sightlines to the parking lot. Michael and the other students would spread out through the crowd, ready to call for help and serve as additional witnesses. Roberto would be present as well, officially chaperoning the homecoming dance but actually providing adult supervision for his students' operation. Friday arrived with an autumn crispness that made the evening feel charged with possibility. The homecoming game was Riverside High's biggest social event of the year, drawing alumni, parents, and community members who rarely set foot on the school campus otherwise. The parking lot was packed with cars, and the stands were filled with people wearing the school's blue and gold colors. The atmosphere was festive and celebratory, exactly the kind of environment that Connor was counting on to provide cover for his ambush. Danny arrived at the game with Sophie and Michael, their casual appearance masking the tension that all three of them felt. They had spent the afternoon reviewing their plan repeatedly, identifying potential problems and developing contingencies for various scenarios. Roberto had given each of them a small radio device that would allow them to communicate without relying on cell phones, which could be jammed or monitored. Marcus was already at the game, sitting with Connor's remaining crew members in their usual section of the bleachers. To outside observers, he appeared to be enjoying the festivities, cheering for touchdowns, and participating in the crowd's energy. But Danny could see the strain in his posture, the way his eyes constantly scanned the parking lot for signs of arriving vehicles. The game itself was a blur of noise and motion that Danny found impossible to focus on. His attention was divided between monitoring his radio for updates from Marcus and watching the crowd for any signs of unusual activity. Sophie was positioned near the concession stand with her camera equipment disguised as school spirit photography gear. Michael and the other students from their group had spread out through the stands, each of them maintaining visual contact with at least one other member of their team. The signal came during the third quarter, a brief burst of static followed by Marcus's voice delivering the code phrase they had agreed upon. "The Eagles have landed." Jake Morrison's vehicle had been spotted entering the parking lot, a black SUV with tinted windows that screamed criminal enterprise to anyone who bothered to look closely. Danny felt his heart rate increase as his body prepared for confrontation. But his mind remained calm and focused. This was what years of training had prepared him for, not the techniques themselves but the mental discipline to perform under pressure. He signaled to Sophie and Michael, then began making his way toward the parking lot with the casual pace of someone heading to their car for a forgotten item. The parking lot was dimly lit, with pools of harsh light from overhead fixtures creating dramatic shadows between the rows of vehicles. Danny could see Connor's group gathering near the far end of the lot, three figures who stood out from the typical high school crowd because of their size and the predatory way they moved through the space. Jake Morrison was easy to identify. He shared Connor's build and facial features, but carried himself with the hard confidence of someone who had been in real fights with real consequences. Connor himself was pacing nervously near the SUV, his usual swagger replaced by the jittery energy of someone who was in over his head but too committed to back down. He kept checking his phone, clearly waiting for word that Danny had been located and isolated. Trevor Nash and Madison Reed flanked him, both of them looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized the magnitude of what they had agreed to participate in. Danny positioned himself behind a large pickup truck that provided both concealment and a clear escape route if the situation deteriorated beyond their ability to control it. Through his radio, he could hear Sophie confirming that she had a clear view of the area and was recording everything. Michael's voice came through a moment later reporting that he had contacted Roberto and that help was on standby if needed. The moment of truth came when Connor spotted Danny emerging from behind the pickup truck. For a split second, Connor's face showed relief that his target had finally appeared. Then confusion set in, as he realized that Danny was approaching voluntarily, walking toward them with the confident stride of someone who had nothing to fear. "Well, well," Connor called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot with forced bravado. "Look who decided to join the party. I was starting to think you were too scared to show up." Danny continued walking until he was about 10 feet away from Connor's group, close enough to talk normally, but far enough to react if anyone made a sudden move. "I'm here," he said simply. "Let's get this over with." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his eyes assessing Danny with the clinical detachment of a predator evaluating prey. "So you're the kid who's been causing problems for my little brother," he said. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who had spent time in environments where violence was a daily reality. "Connor tells me you need an attitude adjustment." "Connor tells a lot of stories," Danny replied calmly. "Most of them aren't true." The comment hit its mark and Connor's face flushed with anger. "You humiliated me in front of the entire school," he snarled, taking a step toward Danny. "You made me look weak. You destroyed my reputation." "You destroyed your own reputation," Danny said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "I just stopped you from destroying someone else's artwork. Everything that happened after that was your choice." Jake Morrison was growing impatient with the conversation. "Enough talking," he said, cracking his knuckles in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Let's handle this and get out of here." But as Jake and his associates moved to surround Danny, they discovered that they weren't alone in the parking lot. Marcus Thompson emerged from behind a nearby car, followed by Michael Chen and the other students from Roberto's martial arts class. Sophie appeared from her position near the concession stand, her camera equipment clearly visible as she documented everything that was happening. "Interesting," Danny said, looking around at his assembled friends. "It looks like you're outnumbered." Jake Morrison's expression darkened as he realized that his simple intimidation job had turned into something much more complicated. "This isn't what we agreed to," he told Connor. "You said it would be just one kid. Easy money. He didn't say anything about a whole group. Connor was looking around the parking lot with growing panic, finally understanding that he had miscalculated badly. It doesn't matter how many of them there are, he said desperately. They're just kids. They can't stop us. That was when Roberto Martinez stepped out of the shadows near the school building, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the confrontation. Actually, he said in a voice that carried absolute authority, I think they can. Roberto was not alone. Behind him came Principal Foster, who had been alerted to the situation by the comprehensive evidence that Sophie had compiled over the past 2 weeks. Behind her came 2 police officers who had been stationed at the game as part of routine security but had been briefed on the potential for trouble. The sight of law enforcement caused Jake Morrison's associates to immediately begin backing toward their vehicle, their criminal instincts warning them to retreat before the situation escalated further. But Jake himself stood his ground, his pride and reputation requiring him to maintain his aggressive posture even in the face of overwhelming opposition. This is harassment, Jake declared, though his voice lacked conviction. We haven't done anything wrong. We're just here to watch the game. Principal Foster stepped forward, her authoritative presence commanding attention from everyone in the parking lot. Mr. Morrison, she said, consulting a folder in her hands, we have documented evidence of your brother's plans to assault one of our students. We have recordings of phone conversations discussing payment for criminal services. And we have multiple witnesses who can testify to the threatening behavior that led to this confrontation. Connor's face went ashen as he realized the full extent of his exposure. You can't prove anything, he said, but his voice was shaking. It's just their word against mine. Sophie stepped forward, holding up her camera. Actually, she said with quiet satisfaction, we have it all on video. Every threat, every plan, every attempt to intimidate innocent students. The evidence is comprehensive and irrefutable. The police officers moved to position themselves between Jake Morrison's group and Danny's supporters, their presence effectively ending any possibility of violence. As they began asking questions and taking statements, the reality of the legal consequences began to sink in for Connor and his associates. Jake Morrison was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit assault and criminal intimidation. His associates were questioned and released but would face charges in Denver related to their other criminal activities. Connor Blake was suspended pending a full investigation, his dreams of college football recruitment effectively ended by his own poor choices. But the most significant outcome of the confrontation was not the legal consequences for the perpetrators, but the transformation it represented for Riverside High School as a whole. Word of the evening's events spread quickly through the student body, creating a new narrative about what was possible when victims refused to remain silent. In the weeks that followed, the Valley Martial Arts Academy saw a surge in enrollment as students who had been living in fear discovered that they had options beyond submission and silence. Roberto's philosophy of strength through discipline and protection of the innocent resonated with young people who had been searching for a way to reclaim their dignity and self-respect. The school administration, faced with undeniable evidence of the bullying epidemic that had been festering under their oversight, implemented comprehensive reforms designed to create a safer and more inclusive environment. Anti-bullying programs were expanded, counseling services were restored, and a peer mediation system was established to address conflicts before they escalated to violence. Sophie Williams not only recovered from the trauma of Connor's attack on her artwork, but emerged as a leader in the school's anti-bullying movement. Her documentation skills proved invaluable in creating accountability systems that made it harder for harassment to go unreported or unpunished. Her artistic talents found new purpose in creating awareness campaigns that helped other students recognize and respond to bullying behavior. Michael Chen's transformation from victim to confident young man inspired other students who had been struggling with similar challenges. He became a peer counselor, using his own experiences to help others find the strength to stand up for themselves and seek help when needed. His academic achievements, no longer overshadowed by fear and anxiety, earned him recognition and scholarship opportunities that opened doors to a bright future. Marcus Thompson's decision to break away from Connor's toxic influence and stand with the victims rather than the victimizers became a powerful example of how people could change and grow. His athletic abilities, redirected toward constructive rather than destructive purposes, made him a valuable addition to Roberto's martial arts program and a positive influence on younger students. Danny Martinez discovered that leadership was not about standing alone against injustice, but about inspiring others to find their own strength and courage. The quiet kid who had spent years hiding in the shadows had become a beacon of hope for students who had felt powerless and alone. His martial arts skills were important, but his willingness to use those skills in defense of others was what truly made him a hero. Roberto Martinez watched his son's growth with the pride of a father and the satisfaction of a teacher who had seen his most important lessons take root in fertile ground. The dojo that he had built as a sanctuary for serious martial arts study had become something even more valuable, a community center where young people could learn not just how to defend themselves physically, but how to develop the character and confidence needed to navigate an often hostile world. Principal Foster, chastened by her failure to recognize and address the bullying crisis before it reached a breaking point, implemented policy changes that transformed Riverside High School into a model for other institutions struggling with similar problems. The comprehensive documentation that Sophie and her allies had compiled became the foundation for training programs that helped administrators and teachers recognize the warning signs of systematic harassment. The story of Danny Martinez and his friends became legend at Riverside High School, passed down from one class to the next as an example of what was possible when ordinary people found the courage to do extraordinary things. But more importantly, it became a template for how communities could come together to protect their most vulnerable members and create environments where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. The transformation was not immediate or complete. There were setbacks and challenges, moments when the old patterns of behavior reasserted themselves and required renewed vigilance to overcome. But the foundation had been laid for lasting change, and the students who had been part of that initial movement carried those lessons with them as they graduated and moved on to college and careers. Years later, when alumni returned to Riverside High School for reunions and special events, they would find a campus that was fundamentally different from the one they had known. The culture of fear and intimidation had been replaced by one of mutual respect and support. Students who might once have been targets for harassment were instead celebrated for their unique talents and perspectives. The old gymnasium where Danny, Sophie, and Marcus had first planned their resistance had been renovated and converted into a conflict resolution center, staffed by trained counselors and peer mediators who helped students work through their differences before they escalated to bullying or violence. The space that had once stored forgotten trophies and abandoned equipment now served as a sanctuary for students who needed a safe place to process their emotions and develop healthy coping strategies. Roberto's Valley Martial Arts Academy expanded to include satellite programs in local middle schools and elementary schools, reaching students at ages when intervention could prevent them from becoming either victims or perpetrators of bullying behavior. The philosophy of strength through discipline and protection of the innocent became a cornerstone of character education throughout the school district. Danny Martinez went on to study education and psychology in college, eventually returning to Riverside as a teacher and counselor who specialized in helping students navigate the complex social dynamics of adolescence. His reputation as someone who had stood up to bullies and created positive change made him a trusted figure for students who were struggling with their own challenges. Sophie Williams earned a full scholarship to art school and eventually became a graphic designer whose work focused on social justice causes and anti-bullying campaigns. Her artistic talents, which had once made her a target for harassment, became powerful tools for creating awareness and inspiring change in communities across the country. Michael Chin's academic achievements earned him admission to MIT, where he studied computer science and developed innovative technologies for creating safer online environments for young people. His first-hand experience with bullying gave him unique insights into the psychological and social factors that contributed to harassment, making him a sought-after consultant for schools and technology companies. Marcus Thompson used his leadership skills to become a youth counselor and coach, working with at-risk teenagers who were struggling with the same kinds of peer pressure and moral choices that he had faced in high school. His ability to connect with young people who felt lost or confused made him particularly effective at helping them find positive paths forward. The ripple effects of their high school experience continued to spread outward, influencing friends, family members, colleagues, and students in ways that none of them could have predicted. The quiet kid who had stepped out of the shadows to protect a fellow student had unknowingly started a movement that would touch thousands of lives over the course of decades. The lesson of Danny Martinez and his friends was not that everyone needed to be a martial arts expert or a natural leader to make a difference. The lesson was that ordinary people, when they found the courage to stand up for what was right, could create extraordinary change. It was a lesson about the power of community, the importance of protecting the vulnerable, and the transformative potential that existed within every individual who chose to act with compassion and courage. In the end, the story of the shy student who revealed his secret karate skills to protect his classmates became more than just a tale of high school heroics. It became a testament to the possibility of transformation, both personal and institutional. And a reminder that sometimes the most powerful people are those who choose to use their strength not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of others who cannot protect themselves. The halls of Riverside High School still echo with the memory of that autumn evening when everything changed. When a group of students decided that they would no longer accept bullying as an inevitable part of their educational experience. Their courage and determination created a legacy that continues to inspire new generations of students to stand up, speak out, and work together to create communities where everyone can feel safe, valued, and free to pursue their dreams without fear. 5 years had passed since the homecoming confrontation that changed everything at Riverside High School, and the building itself bore witness to the transformation that had taken root in its halls, where once intimidation and fear had ruled the social hierarchy. A culture of mutual respect and academic excellence now flourished. The changes were visible in everything from the anti-bullying murals that decorated the main corridors to the peer mediation center that occupied the space where Connor Blake once held court. Danny Martinez stood in the doorway of his old homeroom, now serving as a substitute teacher while completing his master's degree in educational psychology. At 22, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. His students respected him not because they feared him, but because they understood that he genuinely cared about their well-being and success. The classroom was filled with a diverse group of sophomores who represented the new Riverside High perfectly. Academic achievers sat next to artistic dreamers, athletes collaborated with theater enthusiasts, and social boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable had dissolved into genuine friendships based on shared interests and mutual respect. It was exactly the kind of environment that Danny and his friends had envisioned during those tense weeks of planning their resistance movement. As Danny reviewed the day's lesson plan on conflict resolution, his phone buzzed with a text message from Sophie Williams. She was driving up from Denver for their monthly reunion dinner, bringing news about her latest project, documenting anti-bullying programs in urban schools. Her photography had evolved from a teenage passion into a powerful tool for social change, with her exhibitions raising awareness about youth mental health issues across the country. Michael Chen's message arrived a few minutes later, sent from his dorm room at MIT, where he was completing his doctoral dissertation on artificial intelligence applications in educational settings. His research focused on developing algorithms that could identify patterns of cyberbullying before they escalated to dangerous levels, work that had already attracted attention from major technology companies and educational institutions. Marcus Thompson called during Danny's lunch break, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had found his true calling. He was working as a youth counselor in Chicago, helping teenagers who had been expelled from traditional schools find alternative paths to graduation and success. His own transformation from enabler to advocate had given him unique credibility with young people who had made serious mistakes and were looking for second chances. Even Roberto Martinez had evolved with the times, expanding the Valley Martial Arts Academy to include programs specifically designed for survivors of bullying and trauma. His waiting list included students from across the state, all seeking the kind of holistic approach to self-defense that addressed not just physical techniques, but emotional healing and personal empowerment. The reunion dinner took place at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, which had become something of a shrine to the movement that had started in Riverside High's hallways. The walls were decorated with newspaper clippings about anti-bullying initiatives, photographs from Roberto's expanded martial arts program, and artwork created by students who had found their voices through the peer support networks that Sophie had helped establish. As the 5 friends gathered around their usual table, the conversation naturally turned to the impact their high school experience had continued to have on their adult lives. Each of them had chosen career paths that reflected the lessons they had learned about standing up for others and creating positive change in the world. "I got a call last week from a principal in Portland," Sophie said, passing around photos from her latest exhibition. "Apparently, some of the students there saw my documentary about our experience and decided to start their own anti-bullying program. They're calling themselves the Riverside Movement." Danny smiled at the name, remembering how nervous they had all been about taking on Connor and his crew. It's amazing how far it's spread. I get emails from teachers all over the country asking for advice about implementing peer mediation programs. Michael looked up from his laptop, where he had been showing them his latest research findings. The algorithms I'm developing are based partly on the communication patterns we documented back then. Sophie's evidence collection methods were actually ahead of their time in terms of comprehensive harassment documentation. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. The kids I work with in Chicago face problems that make Connor Blake look like an amateur. Gang recruitment, drug trafficking, family violence. But the principles we learned about standing together and refusing to accept victimization as inevitable. Those principles work in any environment. Roberto, who had been listening quietly while enjoying Mrs. Chen's famous dumplings, finally spoke up. "You've all become teachers in your own ways," he observed. "That's what martial arts is really about. Learning something valuable and then sharing it with others who need it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected guest. Principal Foster, now in her final year before retirement, entered the restaurant with a smile that had become much more frequent since the comprehensive reforms had transformed her school's culture. She spotted their table immediately and approached with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested good news. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," she said, pulling up a chair. "But I wanted to share something with you in person. Riverside High has just been selected as a model school for the state's new anti-bullying initiative. We're going to be hosting delegations from across the country who want to learn about our peer mediation and support programs." The recognition was gratifying, but what pleased Danny most was knowing that current students were benefiting from the changes they had fought to implement. "How are the numbers looking?" he asked, referring to the bullying incident reports that had become a key metric for measuring the school's progress. "Down 87% from 5 years ago," Principal Foster replied proudly. "And the academic achievement scores have improved dramatically. Turns out that students learn better when they're not afraid of being harassed in the hallways." Sophie pulled out her camera, unable to resist documenting this moment for her ongoing project about long-term outcomes of youth activism. "Would you mind if I interviewed some of the current students about their experiences? I think it would be powerful to show how the changes have affected a new generation." "Absolutely," Principal Foster agreed. "In fact, I think you'd be interested to meet our current student body president. She's a sophomore who specifically chose Riverside because of its reputation for supporting students who are different. She's been working on expanding our programs to include elementary and middle schools." The idea of their high school initiative influencing even younger students filled Danny with a sense of accomplishment that was deeper than any personal achievement could have provided. They had succeeded in creating something that was bigger than themselves, a legacy that would continue to protect vulnerable students long after they had moved on to other challenges. As the evening progressed, they shared stories about how their Riverside experience had influenced their adult relationships and career choices. Danny talked about his decision to pursue education rather than the engineering degree his high school counselors had recommended. Sophie described how her trauma had ultimately made her a more empathetic artist and a more effective advocate. Michael explained how being bullied had given him insights into human psychology that enhanced his artificial intelligence research. Marcus's story was perhaps the most dramatic, involving his journey from someone who had enabled cruelty to someone who dedicated his life to preventing it. "I tell the kids I work with that they're not defined by their worst moments," he said. "Everyone deserves a chance to choose who they want to become." Mrs. Chen emerged from the kitchen as the evening wound down, carrying a tray of fortune cookies that she had specially made for the occasion. Instead of generic predictions about love and prosperity, each cookie contained quotes about courage, community, and standing up for what's right. It was her way of honoring the young people who had transformed not just their school, but her understanding of what teenagers were capable of when they set their minds to creating positive change. As they prepared to leave, Roberto pulled Danny aside for a private conversation that had become a tradition at these gatherings. "Your mother would be proud of the man you've become," he said quietly. "She always believed that strength should be used to protect others, especially those who can't protect themselves." Danny nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of sadness and gratitude that came with memories of his mother. Her death had been the catalyst for his withdrawal from the world, but her values had ultimately guided him back into it. "I think about her every time I work with students who are going through difficult times. She taught me that everyone deserves to feel safe and valued. And you've taught that lesson to hundreds of others, Roberto replied. The ripple effects will continue long after we're all gone. The drive back to his apartment gave Danny time to reflect on how much his life had changed since that autumn morning when he first stepped out of the shadows to protect Sophie's artwork. The scared, isolated teenager who had hidden behind hoodies and silence had evolved into someone who spoke at conferences, mentored struggling students, and helped design programs that were being implemented in schools across the nation. His apartment walls were covered with letters from students, teachers, and parents who had been touched by the Riverside story in some way. There were thank you notes from kids who had found the courage to report bullying because they knew that adults would listen and take action. There were messages from teachers who had used their peer mediation model to transform their own classroom dynamics. There were even letters from former bullies who had recognized themselves in the story and sought help to change their behavior. One letter in particular had arrived just the week before, written by a middle school student in Oregon who had been inspired by Sophie's documentary to start an art therapy program for bullying victims. The 12-year-old had organized fundraisers, recruited volunteer art teachers, and convinced her school administration to provide space for weekly sessions where students could express their feelings through creative activities rather than keeping them bottled up inside. Another recent message had come from a high school principal in Texas, who reported that his student body had voluntarily established a Riverside Pledge, a commitment to intervene when they witnessed harassment and to seek help from trusted adults when they felt overwhelmed by social pressures. The pledge had been signed by over 90% of the student body, creating a school culture where bullying was actively discouraged by peers rather than passively tolerated. These stories reminded Danny that their high school experience had been about more than just stopping Connor Blake or protecting individual victims. It had been about proving that ordinary young people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The lesson had resonated far beyond Riverside High School because it addressed a universal human need, the desire to feel safe, valued, and empowered to pursue one's dreams without fear. As Danny prepared for sleep, he thought about the students he would be teaching the next day, and the ones he hoped to reach through his graduate research. His dissertation focused on the psychological factors that enabled some bullying victims to become advocates, while others remained trapped in cycles of fear and resentment. He was particularly interested in the role that supportive communities played in healing trauma and building resilience. The research had led him to some surprising conclusions about the nature of courage and leadership. True bravery, he had learned, was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite fear when action was needed. Leadership was not about having all the answers, but about inspiring others to find their own strengths and solutions. And healing was not a solitary process but something that happened best in environments where people felt connected to others who understood their struggles. These insights had applications far beyond school bullying, extending to workplace harassment, community violence, and even international conflicts. The principles they had discovered as teenagers, the importance of documentation, the power of unified resistance, the necessity of addressing root causes rather than just symptoms, were being applied by activists and reformers in contexts they never could have imagined. Danny's phone buzzed with one final message of the evening, this one from a former student who had graduated 2 years earlier. Sarah had been one of his first success stories as a substitute teacher, a shy freshman who had been targeted because of her unusual fashion sense and her passion for vintage music. With Danny's encouragement and the support of the peer mediation program, she had not only survived high school but thrived, eventually becoming the editor of the school newspaper and using that platform to highlight student achievements rather than social drama. Now Sarah was a college sophomore studying journalism, and her message contained exciting news about an investigative series she was writing about the long-term effectiveness of anti-bullying programs. She wanted to feature Riverside High as a case study in successful institutional change, focusing on how student-led initiatives could create lasting cultural shifts when supported by enlightened adult leadership. The request pleased Danny immensely, not because it would bring attention to their story, but because it represented the next generation taking ownership of the movement they had started. Sarah and students like her were no longer just beneficiaries of anti-bullying programs. They were becoming advocates and innovators in their own right, developing new approaches to old problems and extending the work into areas that the original Riverside group had never considered. As Danny finally turned off the lights and settled into sleep, his last conscious thought was about the morning's first class and the opportunity it would provide to plant new seeds of change in young minds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference, just as every day had since that pivotal moment when he chose courage over comfort and community over isolation. The legacy of Danny Martinez and his friends was not just the specific changes they had created at Riverside High School, but the proof they had provided that transformation was possible when people were willing to stand up for what was right. Their story had become a template for hope, a reminder that even in the darkest situations there were always people willing to step forward and light the way for others. The shy student who had once hidden his strength behind silence and solitude had become a beacon of possibility for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. His secret was no longer about karate techniques or martial arts mastery, but about something far more powerful: the understanding that every individual had the capacity to create positive change when they found the courage to use their unique gifts in service of others. In classrooms and community centers across the country, young people continued to discover that they were not powerless against the forces that sought to diminish their worth and limit their potential. They were learning that strength came in many forms, that leadership could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that the most profound changes often began with a single person's decision to say enough and mean it. The story of Riverside High School had become legend, but its true power lay not in the dramatic confrontation that ended Connor's reign of terror, but in the quiet, daily choices that thousands of students, teachers, and parents continued to make in its wake. Each time someone chose inclusion over exclusion, support over silence, or courage over comfort, they were continuing the work that had begun in a high school hallway when a shy teenager stepped out of the shadows to protect a fellow student's dreams. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.